Today we're going to be looking at ecology, which is a little bit easier to understand because it's a lot more about things that we can touch, things that we can feel and see every single day. And so let's take a look really quickly. Ecology is the root words here, ology meaning the study of, and eco meaning our house pretty much, or our home. So it's the study of how living things interact with each other and then how those living things interact with their environment. So we're going to be looking at a lot of things like predator and prey, friend or foe, kind of things like that. An ecosystem, you're going to define this in your notes right there at the top in that table, but an ecosystem is anything that includes a living and non-living factors in a given area. These living and non-living factors, we call them biotic and abiotic. Bio meaning life or living, and then abio, that A in front of it means non or non-living. And so we're going to be looking at those two things. Of course, these two definitions, you're going to need to write them down. You're going to need to remember them and give the example. Something that's living would be plants and animals, fungi and bacteria, whereas non-living parts would be like the wind or the soil or the weather or the water, anything that you can still see, you can still touch, but is not alive. And so here's another picture of it, these types of examples. Just write a few down on your notes. And ecosystems can be big things or small things, but they are it's just a variety of living things in an ecosystem. Diversity meaning variety, and bio meaning life. And so we've got two different pictures here, two different types of ecosystems as well. And we've already talked about them varying in size. It could be a log representing an ecosystem. It could be a small pond, or it could be an entire mountainous area. Each living thing in an area needs energy. Energy has to be there somewhere. And our ultimate source of energy is the sun. It's the ultimate source is the sun. And what you have on your notes, it says all life requires a source of energy to survive, and that's what you're going to write down. Require energy to survive. And so what we need is our ultimate source being the sun. Now necessarily we don't need it directly, but we do need it in some indirect way as humans. So here's what that looks like. Humans get our energy from, hopefully you can already put this down, but where do humans get our energy? We get our energy from the food we eat. And sooner or later, depending on what type of food we eat, that food gets its energy from other food, or it gets its energy straight from the sun. But somehow the sun is directly correlated or indirectly correlated. So energy flows from the sun to these things that we call producers, and then from the producers, depending on the sun for energy, and then finally, when something consumes a producer, it consumes that energy from the sun. But what I want you to notice here, especially in this picture and on your notes, energy is lost as heat energy at all levels in this picture. So the sun is giving its energy to the plants, but the plants lose some of that energy because it has to work. It has to make things for itself, and so radiation takes some of that heat away, and so we lose it. But then something right here, like this mouse eats this plant, and what we call this, anything that eats something is a consumer, and we'll get to that here in a little bit, so we'll move on. On your notes there, you needed to put here that the sun is our ultimate source. After that, producers come in, and then after the producers, we have consumers. Moving on from here, we have something called a rule of 10%. The rule of 10% is saying that 10% of the sun's energy is lost every single time it is passed down. And so producers, they receive 100% of the sun's energy. 10% of that 100 is 10%. So the next level up only receives 10% of what is left. And so that rule of 10% tells us how much energy is pretty much lost as heat during that time. And we lose some of it as heat because we have to work to try and find our food or work to stay alive, and we use some of it. So the sun gives 100% to the grass. When a grasshopper eats the grass, it only gets 10% of that 100 initial percent. Secondary consumers only get 1% from that 10%, and then lastly, 0.1% for a tertiary consumer. So if you are a tertiary consumer consuming something raw meat like a cow or something, you are only getting 1% of that sun's energy, but we are getting part of the sun's energy. Producers. On your notes here on the left in that table, you're going to write down that these producers are also called autotrophs. And why are they called autotrophs? Well, auto means automatic, or does it by itself. Trough is like a pig trough, so it means eating. And so they self-feed or self-eat because they can make their own energy. They do not have to eat other organisms for energy, so they're not consumers. They produce their own energy. These are things like examples that you're going to have to write down. A plant, some bacteria, a few protists, but mainly plants is what I want you to write down there. All ecosystems depend on producers during this time. All right. Producers use photosynthesis to make their energy or to make their own food. But then next on the right side, we have consumers, which are also called heterotrophs, meaning hetero is the opposite of homo, so it should be other or different, which is right here on this side. And then troph, meaning feeding again or to eat, and that would mean we feed on other or different things. So we are considered consumers. Some examples of that would be cows, because cows consume grass, birds, or fish, or insects. So we depend on these producers. Consumers depend on producers for their energy. Moving on from here, we have 5 major types of consumers. And we'll get to each of these here in a second. I pretty much wrote all of them down for you, but as you can notice, each one of these ends in something called vor. And every vor, what you're going to have to write down there, vor means something that is able to eat. Something that is able to eat. So whenever we're talking about herbivores, vor means to eat. Herb means, hopefully you have already noticed, herb means plant, so eating plants. And we'll get to the rest of these here in a second. But herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. And I left that side blank for you to just kind of fill in on your own. But they eat only plants. And what we call these guys, this is very important, they are primary consumers. Whenever we make these charts, you're going to need to know primary consumers. Next, we have omnivores. Omni just means both plants and animals. So omnivores eat seeds and nuts, and also insects and fungi. Omnivores are considered second level consumers. So they're on the second level and they're consumers. So that would be bears and raccoons and coyotes, many other types of animals, but we eat plants and animals. Carnivores are organisms that only eat other animals. They don't eat plants at all. Most true carnivores will be tertiary consumers. That would be tertiary meaning third level. Crocodiles, lions, wolves, anything in the ocean that only eats animals. And then lastly, we have detritivores. Detritivores only eat dead organisms or decaying organic matter. What we call this is detritus. Detritus is dead things. So millipedes, woodlice, crabs, maggots are things that eat only things that are dead. And then our very last one is a decomposer. Decomposers break down organic matter. So they are mostly microorganisms, which are just very, very small things, and they are important because they keep our cycles going round and round and round. If we did not have them, our organic matter would not be given back to the environment. And if we don't have anything given back to the environment, it will not provide for us. So our last little bit of notes is that we have something called food chains and food webs. And these are just models that show us the sequence of how we feed. And whenever we show a food chain, we use arrows to represent who is giving energy to who. So on your notes, you're going to write down that it's a model that shows feeding relationships. And the arrow means gives energy to. So if I am at this picture, the grass is giving energy to the grasshopper. You can use it that way, or you can always put that the arrow is always pointing at the organism doing the eating. Organism doing the eating. So grasshopper is eating the grass. So the arrow is always pointing at whoever is eating. And food webs, these are just complex models that show networks of feeding relationships. So complex network of feeding relationships is a food web. And this is just the same thing. Here's a big food web right here, but it's showing multiple food chains. So it's going from this one to that one to that one. That is just one food chain right here, but in a mix of multiple food chains, this is a food web. Food webs. What we have are trophic levels in food webs, and these trophic levels are these words that we use right here that I've been using: producer, consumers, and we've got primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. But trophic levels are just the levels of nourishment in a food web or a food chain. So this is important to know whenever you get a question of which of these are the secondary consumers, etc. All right, and then lastly, what we have are food pyramids. Food pyramids are a pyramid that just shows us who is making up or who is eating, and it shows the direction of energy flow.